All right, so you finally bought your dream home. Congrats. But a couple years later, boom, a hidden defect pops up and throws a wrench in everything. Turns out maybe knowing a bit more about construction defects in England and Wales could have saved you a real headache.
Oof. Yeah, that's a nightmare scenario for sure.
Luckily for everyone listening, that's exactly what we're diving into today. Our guide is the RICS, Practice Information on Defects and Rectifications.
The gold standard for surveying professionals.
Exactly, and their insights are seriously helpful. So before we get lost in the weeds, let's start with something basic. What actually counts as a defect in construction? I always assumed it was pretty straightforward. Something's broken, it's a defect, but apparently it's not that simple.
It's way more nuanced than people realize.
Really?
Yeah, the standard construction contracts like JCT, NEC, the big ones, they can actually be pretty vague when it comes to actually defining a defect.
So then how do you figure out if something's a defect or not? Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It all comes down to the specifics in the contract. It's basically a breach of contract. So let's say you're building an extension, and the contract says, red clay roof tiles. Seems simple, right?
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
But what if the contractor uses red concrete tiles instead? Technically, they're still red, but they're not what the contract specified. That difference could be considered a defect even if the concrete tiles work perfectly fine.
Huh. I never thought about how much the wording of the contract could come back to bite you. So anytime something doesn't match the contract exactly, it's a defect.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets interesting. There are two main types of defects, patent and latent. Patent defects are the obvious ones, like a huge crack in the wall or a door that won't close.
Makes sense. You see those right away.
Right, but then you've got latent defects. Those are the hidden issues that can stay hidden for months, even years, like faulty wiring behind a wall or a leaky pipe underground. They're like ticking time bombs.
Okay, those sound scary, especially if you've already moved in and think everything's fine.
Yeah.
So who's responsible for fixing these different types of defects?
Well, that's where the legal side gets fun. For patent defects, it's usually pretty clear-cut. The contractor is responsible. The employer has the right to demand the contractor fix the issue, either while they're still building or within a certain time frame called the rectification period.
So in our wonky door example, you can tell the contractor to fix it before you even move in.
Exactly. But latent defects, those are trickier. Because they pop up later, you're often talking about potential lawsuits years down the road. This is where tort law comes in, things like negligence, or even the Defective Premises Act of 1972, which is specifically about residential buildings.
So if a latent defect causes damage, you could sue the contractor, maybe even the architect, even if the problem wasn't obvious at first.
That's right. It gets complicated, and this is one of the key things the RICS guidance stresses. The type of defect really impacts the legal options you have and what could happen.
So it's not just about getting things fixed, it's about figuring out who's to blame and who pays for any damage.
Exactly. And this brings up a case that the RICS guide mentions, Yarmouth v. France, from way back in 1887. It set a big precedent. A defect is basically anything a reasonable person wouldn't accept.
That seems kind of subjective, though. What bugs one person might not bother someone else.
You're right, it does. But the main takeaway is that even defects that seem obvious can be tricky. Just because something wasn't spotted during those initial inspections doesn't mean it's automatically a latent defect.
So good record keeping and really thorough inspections are super important right from the start. Sounds like it could easily turn into a he said, she said situation.
Absolutely. That's why clear records are so important. The RICS guide really hammers that home. We'll talk more about documentation later, but remember, a well-documented defect is way easier to deal with than one where it's just your word against someone else's.
Got it. Okay, so defects can be tough to define and even tougher to deal with. But let's say we found a defect, now what? Who's supposed to fix it?
That's where we get into contractor liability. And it depends on their role in the project and what the contract actually says. A contractor who's responsible for both the design and the build obviously has more liability than one who just builds based on someone else's plans.
So if the architect makes a bad plan that leads to a defect, they could be held responsible, even if the contractor followed the plans perfectly.
Exactly. That's why defects related to the design can get so messy. Figuring out who's responsible can involve a lot of people and potentially a lot of finger pointing.
This is starting to sound a bit overwhelming. So if I'm planning a building project, what's the best way to protect myself from all this?
That's where really understanding your contract comes in. Different contracts handle defects in different ways, and knowing those details is key. The RICS guide breaks down the main differences between those standard form contracts. That's what we'll look at next.
All right, so we've talked about the different types of defects and the whole legal side of things. Now let's get into the real nuts and bolts. You mentioned that different contracts deal with defects differently. What are the key things to know about these contracts?
Great question. Let's start with JCT contracts. Those are pretty common in England and Wales. Now remember that case we talked about, Yarmouth v. France, where a defect is basically whatever a reasonable person wouldn't accept.
Yeah, it seemed a bit subjective.
Exactly. Well, JCT contracts try to take some of that subjectivity out by being super detailed, especially about inspections. They lay out a very specific process for inspecting the work and give the employer a lot of power to reject anything that doesn't meet the contract standards.
So if I'm using a JCT contract, I'm in a pretty strong position when it comes to quality control.
You got it. And here's where it gets interesting. The RICS guide points out this specific clause 2.34 that can give employers a real advantage. It basically lets them demand a second inspection even if they already accepted the work the first time around.
Wait, really? So if I spot a defect later, even after I've already approved the work, I can still ask for another inspection under a JCT contract?
Yeah, as long as it's within a reasonable time, of course. But it's a really powerful tool that a lot of employers don't even know about. It just goes to show how important it is to understand all the little details of these contracts.
Okay, so JCT contracts are all about detailed inspections and giving the employer more control. What about NEC contracts? I've heard those are becoming more popular.
They are, and there's a good reason for that. NEC contracts take a different approach. They're all about early warning and working together. Instead of focusing on conflict and penalties, they encourage everyone to collaborate and resolve defects as early as possible.
So it's less about blaming each other and more about finding solutions together.
Exactly. It's more proactive, less adversarial. And the RICS guide actually gives a good example of this in action. They highlight the early warning mechanism in NEC contracts, which requires both the contractor and the employer to flag any potential problems right away.
So if the contractor sees something that could become a defect later on, they have to tell the employer immediately.
Yep, and the other way around too. It's all about clear communication and transparency, which can really help prevent those small issues from turning into big problems.
That makes sense. Seems like NEC contracts encourage everyone to be on the same team.
That's the idea. And the RICS guide even suggests that this collaborative approach can lead to faster and cheaper solutions for dealing with defects, which is good for everyone involved.
Okay, so choosing the right contract is obviously a crucial first step. But what happens when the building's almost finished? How do we determine if a project is truly done?
That's where we get to practical completion. It's a huge milestone, especially when it comes to defects.
So practical completion means the building is basically done, even if there are a few small things left to do.
Exactly. Think of it this way. The building is ready to be used for its intended purpose, even if there are a few loose ends to tie up. Those minor outstanding things are often called snagging, and they shouldn't stop the building from being occupied or used.
So like if a few light fixtures are missing or a door handle needs adjusting, that wouldn't stop practical completion.
Nope. Those would be snagging items the contractor would still have to fix, but they wouldn't hold up the entire project.
Got it. So how is practical completion actually certified? Is there like a formal process?
Yeah, there is. Usually a certificate of practical completion is issued, which formally acknowledges that the project has reached this stage. The contract usually says who's responsible for issuing that certificate.
Who is that usually?
It could be the contract administrator or sometimes the architect. Their job is to assess the work and decide if it meets the criteria for practical completion that are laid out in the contract.
But there's some judgment involved.
Absolutely. And this is where things can get a bit tricky. While the concept seems simple, actually certifying practical completion can be complicated, especially when there are those snagging items still hanging around.
How so? If things still need fixing, how can it be considered practically complete?
Well, the definition of practical completion often includes clauses that allow for minor defects to be fixed after the certificate is issued. As long as those defects are minor and don't stop the building from being used, practical completion can still be certified.
Okay, that makes sense. But isn't there a risk that a contractor could try to push for practical completion even if there are bigger problems, just to get the project signed off?
That's a valid concern. That's why the person certifying practical completion, whether it's the contract administrator or the architect, has such an important role. They need to be impartial and really thorough in their assessment to make sure any remaining defects are truly minor and don't affect how the building functions.
So it's a balancing act between acknowledging the project is essentially finished and making sure any outstanding issues are dealt with.
Exactly. And that's where understanding the contract and that specific definition of practical completion is crucial. It's also why good communication and a solid working relationship between all the parties are so important.
Speaking of roles and responsibilities, there's a potential conflict of interest that the RICS guide mentions that I wanted to ask you about.
I'm listening.
What happens when the designer of the project is also the contract administrator? Doesn't that seem like there could be some bias there?
That's a great point. It's a tricky situation, and employers need to be aware of it. If the same person is designing the building and then certifying that it's practically complete, there's definitely potential for bias. They might be tempted to overlook certain defects, maybe even subconsciously, just to protect their own reputation.
So it's like grading your own homework. Not exactly impartial.
Exactly. And it puts the employer in a tough spot because they might not be getting a truly objective assessment of the work.
So how can you avoid this situation?
The best way is to have the designer and the contract administrator be different people. That way you get a more objective assessment and the employer's interests are better protected. But what if the contract says that the designer will also be the contract administrator? Well, then the employer needs to be extra careful.
So if I'm the employer in that situation, what can I do to protect myself?
Bring in your own independent advisor. A chartered surveyor with expertise in defects can provide a second opinion and make sure you're not getting a raw deal. It's about peace of mind and making sure you're getting what you paid for.
That's really helpful advice. Okay, so we've covered the ins and outs of practical completion and some potential issues. But before we move on, let's talk about what happens after practical completion. What are the best practices for managing and documenting defects that might come up later on? We've spent a lot of time talking about contracts and practical completion, but now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What happens when you actually find those defects? What are the best ways to handle them, and what kinds of records should I be keeping?
That's the key question, right? Think of it this way. If there's a dispute about a defect, good documentation is your best friend. It's not enough to just say, hey, there's a problem here. You need clear proof of what the defect is, where it is, when you found it, the whole 9 yards.
So photos, videos, detailed descriptions, anything that can back up my claim.
Exactly. The more evidence, the better. And don't forget test results, especially for things like electrical or plumbing. Those can be really important. The RICS guide actually has a really useful checklist of the types of records to keep in Appendix B. It's like they thought of everything.
That's good to know. So let's say I find a defect and I've documented everything. What's next? Who do I contact and how do I actually get it fixed?
That's where the contract administrator comes in. They're the point person for anything related to defects. The first step is to officially notify the contractor in writing. This isn't about just chatting with them on site. It's about having a record. You need to clearly describe the defect where it is and give the contractor a reasonable time to respond.
So it's like a formal heads up and a deadline for them to take action.
Right. And you need to be clear about what you expect from the contractor. Do you want them to fix it, investigate it further, or something else? Think of it like a polite but firm instruction.
Okay, so I've sent the notification. Now what? Just sit back and wait for them to fix it.
Not exactly. Remember, documentation is important throughout this whole process. Keep copies of all your communication emails, letters, notes from meetings, anything related to the defect. And really importantly, you need to keep an eye on things. Make sure the contractor is actually doing what they said they'd do and that they're doing it on time.
So I'm kind of like a defect detective, making sure the contractor's doing their job.
You could say that the contract administrator is there to guide the process and make sure everything stays on track.
Okay, so what if the contractor just ignores my notification? Or even worse, what if they refuse to fix the defect? What can I do then?
That's when things can get a bit more difficult. The first thing to try is always to resolve the issue amicably through talking and negotiation. But if that doesn't work, you might have to resort to more formal dispute resolution.
Like lawyers' courts, that kind of thing.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And that's why having all those detailed records is so important. It could be what saves you from a long and expensive legal battle. And this brings up another important point that the RICS guide highlights risk management.
Okay, risk management. We hear that term a lot, but what does it actually mean when we're talking about defects?
It's all about being proactive, not reactive. It's
Yeah.
about spotting potential problems before they even happen and taking steps to minimize the risks. And one of the biggest mistakes people make is thinking that insurance will cover everything.
So insurance isn't a magic solution.
No way! While insurance is really important for protecting you financially if things go wrong, it's not a replacement for careful planning and being proactive about managing those risks.
Okay, I'm starting to get the big picture here. So where do I even begin with risk management?
Well, you start by understanding what kinds of defects could happen on your specific project. Different projects have different risks, and knowing those is key. A big apartment building is going to have different potential problems than a single-family house, for instance.
So how do I figure out what those risks might be?
Experience definitely helps, but luckily you don't have to start from scratch. The RICS has tons of guidance on specific types of defects and how to prevent them. Plus, talk to your team, your designers, contractors, anyone with experience. Tap into their knowledge.
So do your research and get advice from the experts around you.
Exactly. And once you've identified those potential risks, you can start thinking about ways to reduce them.
What kind of things can you do?
It could be anything from changing the design to having stricter inspections to putting specific clauses in the contract. It's all in the details, and sometimes even a small change can make a huge difference in preventing problems later on.
So it's all about thinking ahead and being proactive.
Right, and there are a couple of specific risks that I want to highlight because the RICS guide specifically mentions them: fire and water damage.
Those definitely sound like things I want to avoid, but how do I actually prevent them from happening?
With fire safety, it's all about making sure the building regulations are followed during both the design and construction phases. Think about using fire-resistant materials, proper fire escapes, sprinkler systems, the whole works.
So no cutting corners when it comes to fire safety.
Definitely not. It's just not worth the risk. And for water damage, prevention is key. High-quality waterproofing, properly installed pipes, well-maintained roofs. Those are your best defenses.
Got it. So I need to make sure my contractor's on top of all of this.
For sure. And don't forget about insurance. Make sure you have enough coverage for both fire and water damage throughout the entire project.
Okay, you've mentioned insurance a few times. Can we dive into that a little bit more? What types of insurance are really important when it comes to construction defects?
There are three main types that everyone involved in construction should know about. First, there's professional indemnity insurance. This protects professionals like architects, surveyors, engineers if someone claims they were negligent. So if their advice or designs lead to a defect, their insurance helps cover the costs.
So it's kind of like a safety net for professionals
Yeah.
in case they make a mistake.
Right. Then there's contractors' all-risk insurance. This covers damage to the building while it's still under construction. So if there's a fire, flood, or some other unexpected event that damages the building, this insurance helps pay for the repairs.
Sounds like something every contractor should have.
Definitely. It gives both the contractor and the employer peace of mind. And lastly, there's latent defects insurance. We talked about how tricky those latent defect claims can be. So this type of insurance is especially important. It covers defects that might not show up for years after the project is finished.
So it's like a long-term protection plan just in case a hidden problem pops up later.
That's it. It can cover the costs of fixing the defect and any damage it caused.
Okay, so those three types of insurance: professional indemnity contractors, all risk, and latent defects insurance. They all sound pretty crucial for anyone involved in construction. Anything else I should know about insurance?
One important thing, remember that not all insurance policies are the same. Read that fine print. Make sure you understand what's covered, what's not covered, and what you have to do to make a claim. Don't just assume you're automatically protected.
Good advice. So besides insurance, are there any other ways to limit my liability when it comes to defects?
Absolutely. It starts with the contract. You need a clear and well-written contract that spells out everything in detail. Being vague is a recipe for disaster. The more clear the contract is, the less likely you are to have arguments and disputes later on.
So it's all about being specific and making sure everything is crystal clear.
Yep. And beyond the contract, quality control is essential. Make sure you have really strong quality control procedures throughout the whole project so the work is done right the first time.
So regular inspections, testing, detailed record keeping, making sure everything is up to standard.
Exactly. And never be afraid to ask for expert advice if you're not sure about something. It's always better to be safe than sorry, especially when it comes to construction.
Well, we've covered so much today. Contracts, inspections, documentation, insurance, risk management. It's a lot to think about. Is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with before we wrap up?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this is about more than just laws and technical stuff. Building is about people. It's about creating spaces where people live, work, and enjoy themselves. And in the end, we all have a responsibility to make sure those spaces are safe, functional, and built to last.
So it's about taking pride in our work and putting the well-being of the people who will be using those buildings first.
Absolutely. Defects aren't just an inconvenience. They can have a real impact on people's lives. So let's all try our best to minimize those risks and build a better, safer, and more sustainable future for everyone.
That's a great way to put it. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of construction defects. Hopefully our listeners now have the knowledge and tools they need to navigate this complex topic. Until next time, happy and defect-free building, everyone.